The life of a soldier under the Nazi regime was not the heroic image shown by propaganda. Behind the parades and the flags there was mud, hunger, fierce discipline, humiliating punishments, and an everyday brutality that marked every minute. Such was, in raw flesh, the existence of those men trapped in Hitler's war machine. From the desk to the barracks, indoctrination and Hitler youth. The life of the soldier in the Nazi regime did not begin with the rifle in his hands, nor with the grey uniform at the front. It began years earlier, at wooden desks where children were molded to become future combatants. From early childhood, the state penetrated every aspect of their education, distorting the everyday until children's games turned into war simulations and loyalty to the homeland became confused with submission to the Führer. In schools, mathematics textbooks asked to calculate the trajectory of bullets or the number of Jews to deport in arithmetic problems. In biology classes, teachers showed sheets with skulls and profiles to demonstrate the racial inferiority of peoples that the students would one day face on the battlefield. History was a truncated narrative. Germany humiliated in Versailles, Hitler's genius as redeemer, the inescapable destiny of conquering living space. Geography was taught not to understand the world, but to visualize future conquests, maps with red arrows pointing eastward, crossing Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. In this environment, children learned early on that they were not individuals but parts of a machine. School songs repeated verses of sacrifice and obedience. They were taught to shout slogans, to march in line through the hallways, to raise their arms in salute every time a teacher entered. The school was the antechamber of the barracks, a space where discipline replaced curiosity and loyalty supplanted any independent thought. The next step was the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, where childhood life was definitively subordinated to paramilitary training. Saturdays were no longer days of rest. They were days of marches of 10 or 15 kilometers, with backpacks filled with stones to harden the muscles. In the summer camps, the adolescents slept in damp tents under strict discipline, rising to the trumpet call at dawn. Breakfast was scarce, black bread and watered coffee, but no one dared to complain. The slogan was to harden the body, and the instructors made sure that fatigue and hunger became routine. The activities were designed to erase the boundary between play and war. Compressed air shooting competitions were accompanied by harangues about the future struggle against the enemies of the Reich. Orientation practices in forests included ambush exercises, where some groups learned to surround and capture the others. In the songs around the campfire, the lyrics spoke of fallen comrades and the pride of dying for Germany. Even leisure was militarized. Board games with pieces representing panzer divisions, contests for building model tanks and airplanes, collective readings of stories of heroes of the First World War. The control was so absolute that the family was relegated. Many parents saw their children grow distant, even correcting their elders if they showed doubts about the regime. A 15-year-old boy could denounce his own father to a Hitlerjugend instructor if he heard a critical comment about Hitler. Obedience to the Führer was above any family bond. The home, which in other times had been a refuge, became a space watched by the children themselves. The daily details of the Hitlerjugend show how the body and mind were molded. The night marches were especially brutal, 20-kilometer outings with lights off, crossing forests and swamps where the weakest lagged behind and were publicly humiliated upon returning. The instructors shouted insults, forced them to do push-ups in the mud or to remain under freezing rain. Everything was designed to instill endurance and blind obedience. Whoever cried was reminded that the Russians would show no mercy. The uniform itself was a symbol. The brown shirt, the armband with the swastika, the leather belt, the boots polished until they shone. Each garment was part of a ritual. The youth spent hours preparing their uniform, and a misplaced button could mean a physical punishment or the mockery of their comrades. Appearance was part of discipline. A soldier had to be impeccable even before being a soldier. Food reinforced the character of endurance. In the camps, meals were rationed: hard bread, watery soups, boiled potatoes. Instructors repeated that hunger was training for the front, where there would be even less. In some cases, the youths were forced to hunt or gather their own food in the forests, teaching them that survival was part of a soldier's life. Eating became an act of discipline, not of pleasure. In the cities, the parades of the Hitlerjugend were part of daily life. Columns of adolescents marched with synchronized steps through the streets, singing martial songs that echoed between the buildings. Passers-by were obliged to stop and watch, and many parents looked on with a mix of pride and fear at those children transformed into pieces of a mechanism they no longer controlled. For the boys themselves, the parades were moments of exaltation. Feeling part of a uniform mass erased any individual insecurity. Indoctrination was not limited to adolescence. At 18 years of age, the transition to the barracks was immediate. Many young men went from youth camps to military barracks within weeks, with only one summer separating singing around a campfire from receiving orders from a sergeant. That continuity was deliberate. The regime left no empty spaces. The boy who had learned to march in lines at 12 now did so with a real rifle at 19. The first days in the barracks reinforced what had been learned in the Hitler Youth. Life was ruthlessly regulated, waking at dawn to the shouting of non-commissioned officers, running to the frozen yard to form in line, breakfasting in minutes, and going out to endless marches carrying full equipment. Whoever fell received rifle butt blows. Whoever complained was punished with hours of exercise until exhaustion. But the most feared were not the physical punishments, but the humiliation in front of comrades. Being marked as weak was an indelible stain. The smallest details were controlled: the way to make the bed, the shine of the boots, the order in the locker. Everything was subject to meticulous inspections. An insignificant mistake could provoke the fury of the instructors, who overturned cots, threw clothes on the floor, and forced the recruits to start over amid shouts and blows. The life of the Nazi soldier was, from the beginning, a routine of forced perfection under constant threat. In this environment, camaraderie did not arise from spontaneous friendship, but from the need to survive discipline together. The youths learned to watch each other's backs, to share hidden rations, to exchange words of encouragement when no one else listened. Brotherhood was born from shared suffering, from cold nights in poorly heated barracks, from common hunger in dining halls where the rations were never enough. The regime knew it was forming more than soldiers. It was manufacturing instruments of total obedience. The everyday detail, the watery soup, the shiny button, the night march, the public humiliation, was not accessory. It was the method. Thus, when these young men reached the front, they were already accustomed to suffering in silence, to obeying without question, to considering hunger and cold not as misfortunes but as a natural part of life. The Nazi soldier was not forged in the trenches. He was built at the desks, in the youth camps, in the training barracks. His real life was marked from the beginning by the discipline imposed in daily life by a state that had invaded even games and songs. Each step of that formation, each brutal detail, pushed him toward an inevitable destiny: to become another cog in the war machine that would devour Europe. Training and discipline, the forging of the Lanza. The passage from indoctrinated youth to the soldier trained in the barracks was a descent into a world where discipline was imposed with daily brutality. The Lanza, as the German private soldier was known, was not shaped in the abstract by great speeches, but in the smallest details of daily life: the way of walking, of holding the rifle, of making the bed, of eating in silence. Everything was designed to break individuality and replace it with a conditioned reflex of obedience. The first contact with the barracks was usually a shock. The young men arrived with only a suitcase and were received by shouts reminding them that they were no longer boys but recruits. They were stripped of their civilian clothes and given a uniform that, although badly fitted or rough, had to be worn with millimetric precision. The adaptation time was non-existent. The first day they were already in line, learning to march with their eyes forward under the constant threat of rifle butt blows or physical punishments if they made a mistake. The daily routine was relentless. The reveille sounded before dawn, and within seconds the recruits had to be on their feet, with beds impeccably made, uniforms on, and boots aligned in front of the cot. Any delay was punished with push-ups, running around the yard, or carrying sandbags until exhaustion. Breakfast was taken in a few minutes in absolute silence under the gaze of the non-commissioned officers who checked every gesture. The meal itself became part of the discipline. Eat quickly, without speaking, without looking to the sides, with the fork in the correct hand and without spilling a single crumb. Marches were the core of the training. They were not simple physical exercises, but endurance tests meant to break the will. Endless kilometers carrying full equipment, rifle, backpack, helmet, ammunition, utensils, blankets, and at times logs of wood used as collective punishment. The mud clung to the boots, the legs burned, the shoulders bled under the weight of the straps. The one who collapsed received no compassion. He was dragged, insulted, and forced to get up under rifle butt blows. These night marches with flashlights off, crossing forests and fields in silence, left the men in such a state of exhaustion that they slept standing when stopping in formation. Weapons training was just as severe. The rifle had to be an extension of the body to clean, assemble, load, and fire with obsessive precision. A lancer had to be able to disassemble and reassemble his weapon in complete darkness, under pressure, with shouts in his ear and his hands numb from the cold. The slightest carelessness, a poorly stored cleaning rod, a rifle with traces of mud in the barrel, was reason for punishments that could last hours. The shooting instruction took place under extreme conditions, lying in the mud in improvised trenches with an empty stomach. Marksmanship was not just a skill, it was a matter of surviving the training. Discipline extended to the smallest things. The uniform had to be without a single wrinkle, the boots polished until they shone, the hair cut short. A loose button could mean the entire unit spent the night standing in the rain. The non-commissioned officers were ruthless in their inspections, overturning cots, throwing belongings to the ground and forcing them to start over again and again. What mattered was not order itself, but unconditional obedience to the figure of authority. Physical punishment was a pedagogical method. Endless push-ups, crawling through the mud, carrying comrades on their backs or running with the rifle over their heads were part of the routine. Blows were common, and pain was normalized as part of a soldier's life. Fear turned into reflex. A single shout was enough for everyone to line up in seconds, trembling with fatigue but not daring to show it. Humiliation was another constant resource. Whoever failed was ridiculed in front of his comrades, burdened with offensive nicknames that followed him for months. The weakest were forced to repeat exercises until vomiting, while the others watched in silence, knowing that a gesture of compassion would put them in the same situation. In this way, discipline was imposed not only from above, but also from within the group. No one wanted to be punished because of another, and peer pressure was as strong as that of the non-commissioned officers. Ideological instruction was intertwined with physical training. Each march, each exercise, each weapons class was accompanied by speeches about the historical mission of the German soldier, to destroy Bolshevism, to subjugate entire peoples, to serve as the vanguard of the Reich. The instructors repeated that suffering was a necessary test, a foretaste of what awaited them in the East. Propaganda films were shown in the barracks, fragments of Mein Kampf were read, and slogans were recited before sleeping. Physical and mental discipline went hand in hand. Obeying orders without thinking was as important as keeping the rifle clean. Combat exercises were designed to simulate real chaos. The recruits were thrown into trenches full of mud under simulated explosions, with machine gun fire over their heads and the shouts of instructors forcing them to advance. Some came out with real injuries due to the brutality of the exercises, but that did not stop the practice. It was said that whoever could not endure training would not survive in Russia. Fatigue was cumulative. Weeks without real rest, with few hours of sleep and insufficient food, left the recruits exhausted with cramped muscles and clouded minds. The regime sought precisely that, to eliminate any trace of individual will, to reduce the person to a gear that functioned even without thinking. The life of the Lancer was the learning of absolute submission to duty, of the sacrifice of body and mind in the name of obedience. In that environment, camaraderie arose as a survival mechanism. Sharing a cigarette, hiding a piece of bread, covering for a comrade during inspection. These minimal gestures became the only way to withstand the pressure. However, even that fraternity was tinged with discipline. The group functioned as a single body, and whoever did not keep pace was set apart, punished, and in some cases pushed to the edge of madness. The Lancer was not forged on a battlefield, but in a barracks where every second was watched, every gesture corrected, every mistake punished. Training not only taught how to shoot or march, but how to annul the will, to accept pain as part of daily life, to live with the constant fear of humiliation or punishment. That real life, marked by brutal discipline, prepared the soldier not only to obey but to accept as natural the extreme suffering that awaited him on the Eastern Front. In the mud of the East, hunger, cold, and exhaustion. The destiny of those boys who had passed through the desks, the youth camps, and the brutal forge of the barracks was the Eastern Front. Their theory shattered into pieces before a merciless reality. What they had learned in classrooms and barracks became insufficient when they had to walk endless kilometers through fields covered in mud, sleep outdoors in temperatures that froze the blood, and survive on rations that barely kept them standing. The real life of the Lanza in the East was not defined by strategic victories or defeats, but by the daily details of a body in constant wear and a mind on the verge of collapse. The marches were an endless torment. The soldiers advanced for hours and hours, carrying rifles, ammunition, heavy backpacks, utensils, and blankets that became unbearable burdens after 20 or 30 kilometers. In autumn, the mud trapped them up to their knees. Each step was a colossal effort to pull the boot out of the mire. The constant sound was that of souls being sucked by the quagmire, the gasps of exhausted men, and the crack of the whips that officers used on the horses pulling the artillery pieces. When the cold came, the mud froze and turned into blades of ice that tore apart the feet inside the boots. Many soldiers ended their days with socks soaked in blood, blackened or torn-out nails, and blisters that became infected without remedy. Hunger was another constant enemy. The official rations consisted of hard bread, watery soups, a little canned meat, and barley coffee. On the Eastern Front, those rations rarely arrived complete. The German logistical system was not prepared for such enormous distances. Convoys were delayed for days due to the poor condition of the roads, partisan attacks, or lack of fuel. Thus, the soldiers learned to survive on whatever they found: potatoes stolen from villages, pieces of meat from dead horses in the field, even boiled tree bark to trick their empty stomachs. Hunger became an obsession. Many soldiers wrote in their letters more about food than about combat, describing with nostalgia a plate of hot soup or a piece of fresh bread that they knew they would never taste again at the front. The cold was worse than hunger. The Russian winter was an invisible enemy that killed in silence. Temperatures dropped to 30 or 40 degrees below zero, and the German uniforms were not prepared for such a climate. The coats were thin, the boots lacked insulation, the gloves were scarce. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper or rags, tied pieces of blankets around their hands, shared blankets among several men, but nothing was enough. The nights were lethal. Men huddled together for warmth, yet still awoke stiff with cracked skin and blue lips. Frost covered blankets and helmets, and many woke dead without anyone realizing until the morning formation revealed gaps in the line. The cold destroyed weapons as much as bodies. Rifles jammed, oil froze, triggers did not respond. Soldiers learned to sleep with their rifles inside their blankets to keep them warm. Machine guns failed at the most critical moments, and artillery pieces became useless as their mechanisms froze. Metal burned the skin on contact, and many lost fingers while trying to handle parts without gloves. The snow blinded, covered trenches, buried bodies and ammunition, erased paths. Exhaustion was permanent. There was no real rest. The night watches forced them to stand for hours, motionless, under the freezing wind, alert to any movement in the darkness. Sleep was fragmented, stolen in minutes between bombings, marches, and battles. Soldiers learned to sleep standing, leaning on their rifles, or to lie down on the frozen ground for just a few seconds. The body never recovered. Fatigue was cumulative, and after weeks without sleeping more than 2 hours at a time, men began to lose their sense of reality. Some saw figures in the snow, others heard non-existent voices, others collapsed in the middle of a march, never able to rise again. Filth was another torment. There was no water to wash, clothes were not changed for months, lice infested every seam of the uniforms. The soldiers scratched themselves until they bled, leaving red stains on the grey shirts. The stench was unbearable. Sweat, mud, blood and excrement mixed in the barracks and trenches. Diseases spread easily: dysentery, typhus, pneumonia. The army could barely send medicine, and most men learned to endure fever and pain as an inevitable part of their existence. Combat added another layer of brutality. After an exhausting march, after days without eating or sleeping, the soldiers were thrown into attack. The mud swallowed bodies, bullets whistled through the snow, shells raised clouds of frozen earth that fell like shrapnel on their faces. Hunger and cold weakened them so much that many could barely lift their rifles, yet they were still ordered to advance. Those who fell were left behind, their bodies covered by snow or crushed by tanks. There was no time to bury them, and the sight of frozen comrades, stiff like grotesque statues on the battlefield, became part of the landscape. Life in the trenches was an endless torment, holes filled with mud and icy water, where men spent days unable to dry themselves. Their feet swelled, turned black from frostbite, and many were evacuated not for combat wounds but because they could no longer walk. The enemy was always near, launching shells, grenades, or simply waiting for the cold to do the job. Fear was constant, of the night attack, of the bombing, of falling asleep and never waking again. Contact with the civilian population offered no relief. The Russian villages were miserable, destroyed, empty of supplies. The peasants, when they remained, looked with hatred at the soldiers who seized their last reserves. Bread was snatched from the hands of children, houses were burned to obtain firewood, animals slaughtered without hesitation. The war against hunger was twofold, against the empty stomach and against the accusing eyes of those who lost everything. In the midst of this hell, camaraderie was the only salvation. Sharing a cigarette, a piece of hard bread, a half-torn blanket. The men covered each other during marches, crawled to rescue a frozen comrade, laughed at macabre jokes to forget the misery. But even camaraderie was marked by exhaustion. No one could carry another's weight for long. At some point, everyone was left alone before the cold, the hunger, and the fatigue. Such was real life on the Eastern Front, a cycle of hunger that emptied the stomach, cold that numbed the muscles, and exhaustion that destroyed the mind. Each day was a battle against one's own body, a struggle to take one more step in the mud, to endure one more minute in the snow, to resist one more instant with eyes open on night watch. The Soviet enemy was fearsome, but even more fearsome were the hunger, the cold, and the exhaustion that slowly devoured each Lanzer, turning existence into an endless torment. The Panzer War, glory and doom of the armored. When speaking of the German army under the Nazi regime, the image that prevails is that of the armored panzer making its way with thunder, crushing obstacles, launching columns of smoke and fire in its advance. But behind that triumphalist iconography, the real life of the men who inhabited those machines was an extreme experience, at once fascinating and damning. The tank, symbol of the Blitzkrieg, was also a steel coffin where glory mixed with exhaustion, constant fear, and the certainty that the enemy was always lying in wait. The interior of a panzer was a tiny space, designed more for war efficiency than for the comfort of its crew. 5 men shared a suffocating space of barely a few cubic meters where every movement was calculated. The commander in the turret, the gunner with his eye pressed to the sight, the loader wedged among heavy shells, the driver before the stiff levers, and the radio operator who also served as machine gunner. There was no room to stretch or rest. The air was thick with smoke, grease, sweat, and gunpowder. For hours those men remained boxed in, breathing the same overheated air in summer or trembling in winter as frost formed on the metal walls. The routine was exhausting even without firing a single shot. Starting the engine required precise coordination. The gears squealed and every movement was accompanied by a deafening roar. The oil level, fuel pressure, and track wear had to be constantly checked. The loader sweated, handling shells weighing more than 20 kilograms, often with his hands numb from the cold. The driver had to fight against levers that demanded brute strength for every maneuver, while the commander shouted orders above the thunderous noise. The gunner had to keep his gaze fixed, seeking targets through narrow sights that limited his perception of the outside world to a small circle, a constant window toward death. Panzer battles were a whirlwind of adrenaline and terror. The tanks advanced in formation, raising clouds of dust or snow, the ground trembling beneath the weight of the treads. From inside, the crew saw only flashes, a shadow on the horizon that could be a Soviet T-34, a burst of light signaling that someone had just fired, a brutal jolt meaning their armor had been hit. Time was measured in seconds. Load, aim, fire, correct. Each shell that left the cannon could mean the destruction of an enemy or a missed shot that would bring immediate retaliation. The Soviets deployed thousands of T-34 tanks, which often outnumbered the German panzers. That numerical superiority made the battles desperate. 3 or 4 panzers could find themselves surrounded by dozens of T-34s, forced to maneuver without rest, seeking firing positions, relying on the gunner's aim and the resistance of the armor. The armor, however, was no guarantee. When an enemy shell struck, the inside of the tank turned into a furnace of fire and shrapnel. The air filled with smoke and flames, the crew shouted while trying to open the hatches to escape. Many died, burned alive without managing to get out, trapped in a coffin of burning iron. Maintenance was a daily torment. After every march, the crew had to spend hours checking tracks, cleaning filters, repairing damage with makeshift parts that barely fit. Mud clung to the wheels until they were immobilized, ice froze the joints, dust damaged the engines. The soldiers worked with hands full of grease and wounds without rest, often under enemy fire. In winter, the frozen metal burned the skin. In summer, the inside of the tank could exceed 50 degrees. The tank was both weapon and burden. It demanded continuous effort that wore the men down as much as combat itself. Physical exhaustion mixed with psychological strain. The constant engine noise, the rattling of the treads, the impact of shells against the armor, the echo of nearby explosions created a state of permanent tension. The men slept standing, bent over the metal seats, still wearing their helmets, seizing minutes between battles. The lack of sleep made their movements clumsy, their aim worse, their mistakes more frequent. Many crewmen suffered partial deafness, chronic migraines, and trembling hands. Food was another problem. Rations did not always reach the armored front. In many cases, the crew had to survive on hard biscuits, cold preserves, and rationed water, all consumed inside the tank, where the smell of food mixed with that of fuel and gunpowder. There was no privacy. Urinating or defecating inside the armored vehicle was part of the routine, accumulating an unbearable stench that permeated clothes and skin. The cold was devastating. In the Russian steppes, tanks were trapped in the snow. The engines would not start, the treads froze. The men had to light improvised fires under the armored hulls to thaw the oil, exposing themselves to attacks while trying to start the machines. The frozen metal pierced boots and gloves, and many crewmen suffered severe frostbite. The contrast with summer was brutal. In the suffocating heat, men fainted inside the tank, dizzy from the toxic engine fumes and the lack of fresh air. Despite the hardships, the panzers inspired a contradictory feeling of pride and doom. For many soldiers, being part of an armored crew was a privilege. It meant being in the vanguard, bearing the weight of the attack, representing the strength of the Reich. But that glory was fleeting. The life expectancy of a panzer crewman in the battles of the East was short. Many did not survive more than a few weeks of intense operations. The comrade who had shared rations the night before could disappear the next day in a ball of fire, and all that remained was a scorched helmet or a twisted piece of armor plate. Camaraderie inside a panzer was unique, forged in physical proximity and the certainty of shared death. The 5 men knew each other in detail, the tone of the gunner's voice when hitting a target, the driver's gesture before a maneuver, the sigh of the exhausted loader. That extreme intimacy united them like brothers, but also multiplied the pain of each loss. A destroyed tank was not just one machine less, it was the disappearance of a human microcosm that had existed within those plates of steel. The panzers represented the duality of the Nazi war, symbols of power and modernity, but also instruments of inhuman suffering for those who crewed them. The real life of the men who inhabited those armored vehicles was made of sweat, fear, hunger, and fire. In every triumphant advance, a condemnation was hidden. The tank could open the way, but it could also become a burning tomb in a matter of seconds. For the steel Lanzer, glory was always accompanied by the brutal echo of doom. The men of the air, life in the Luftwaffe. The romantic image of the German aviator, impeccable in his blue uniform, leather helmet and goggles shining in the morning light, contrasted brutally with the reality lived by thousands of men of the Luftwaffe. If for propaganda they were knights of the air, in real life they were young men thrown into a deadly trade where each mission meant playing heads or tails with death. The sky of the Third Reich was not a space of glory, but an implacable territory where cold, noise, constant tension, and the certainty of being shot down accompanied every minute. The routine began in improvised airfields, many of them little more than muddy fields in Poland, Russia, or France, where the runways were strips of beaten earth full of holes. Mechanics worked without rest, greasing engines under snow or scorching sun, with blackened hands and ears filled with the incessant roar of the Junkers and Messerschmitts taking off and landing without pause. The pilots slept in cold barracks, on iron cots, often dressed in their flight clothes because they never knew when they would be called urgently. preparations for each mission were brief: a bowl of watery coffee, a piece of hard bread, a quick review of maps and coordinates. Then came the ritual of putting on the flight uniform: sheepskin jacket, lined boots, helmet, goggles, thick gloves that often hindered control. Getting into the plane meant entering a metal cage where the roar of the engine drowned out one's own thoughts. Takeoff was always a moment of tension. Many aircraft crashed on the very runway due to technical failures, excess weight, or ground conditions. The cold was an invisible and constant enemy. At heights of 5,000 meters, the cockpit became a freezer. Breath turned into ice on the visors, hands lost all feeling even under several layers of gloves, and feet grew stiff inside the boots. Some pilots urinated on themselves to gain a few seconds of warmth. The less fortunate suffered frostbite on their fingers, which after several missions turned purple or remained numb for life. Aerial combat was a brutal whirlwind. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, fast and maneuverable, hurled themselves against Soviet or British formations in dizzying dives. The pilot had only seconds to aim and fire while the machine guns spat fire and the plane shuddered from the recoil. The sky filled with white trails, bursts of tracers, fragments of metal flying at full speed. The noise was deafening. The roar of the engine mixed with the rattle of weapons and the shouts over the radio. One instant of distraction meant death. An enemy burst could pierce the cockpit, tear off a wing, or ignite the fuel tank. The bombings were even worse. The crews of the Heinkels or Junkers 88 spent hours over the target, enduring anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a hell of black explosions. Each blast shook the plane, sent fragments against the fuselage, and riddled the wings with holes. The bomber kept advancing as the crew heard the whistling of shrapnel piercing the metal, wondering whether the next impact would split them in two. The tail gunners fired until they went deaf, while the pilots struggled to maintain course with trembling hands. Being shot down was a constant fear. When a plane was hit, it became a death trap. Fire in the cockpit, black smoke filling the lungs, engines exploding like bombs. The men had to jump with parachutes from extreme heights under enemy fire, knowing that even if they survived the fall, they could land in the hands of partisans who did not hesitate to lynch captured pilots. Others died, trapped inside, burned alive, or smashed against the ground. At the airfields, mechanics collected charred remains of bodies that could barely be identified by the serial numbers of the aircraft. The Luftwaffe imposed an exhausting rhythm of missions. Some pilots flew 3 or 4 times a day without rest, with empty stomachs and shattered nerves. Fatigue accumulated, reddened eyes, trembling hands, slowed reflexes. Many fell not for lack of skill, but from sheer exhaustion. They slept wherever they could, in the cockpits, on ammunition crates, wrapped in greasy blankets at the edge of the runway. Propaganda glorified the aces of the air like Galland or Hartmann, but the reality was that most pilots survived only a few missions before dying. The life expectancy of a novice in 1943 was barely a few weeks. Those who survived carried physical and psychological scars, partial hearing loss, burns on the face from cockpit fires, recurring nightmares of planes in flames spiraling downward. Hunger spared no one, not even in the air. The rations at the airfields were miserable: watery soups, black bread, occasionally a piece of meat. The men ate standing in haste, knowing that in minutes they would be called to take off. Tobacco and coffee were treasures shared as symbols of camaraderie, small islands of normality in a sea of misery. Camaraderie was the only thing that preserved sanity. The bomber crews knew each other in detail. They entrusted their lives to one another on every mission. They shared macabre jokes, improvised songs, toasts with cheap liquor on the few free nights. But each farewell on the runway could be the last. Returning from a mission and seeing the gaps in formation was a constant reminder of the fragility of life in the Luftwaffe. Being a man of the air under the Nazi regime was not a glorious privilege, it was a sentence. The blue uniform, the wings embroidered on the chest, the heroic tails were merely a mask hiding a brutal reality. The pilots and crews lived amid cold, hunger, extreme fatigue, and the daily certainty of death. In the sky of the Reich, there were no nights, but exhausted men trapped in machines that could become burning coffins in a matter of seconds. That was the real life of the soldiers of the air, a hell suspended among the clouds. Comradeship and brotherhood at the front. If anything sustained the Lancer amid the endless war in the East, it was the bond with the man beside him. Neither ideology nor propaganda nor the orders of officers could keep a hungry, frozen, or utterly exhausted soldier standing. What kept him moving forward, what forced him to rise once more from the mud, was comradeship. The certainty that if he fell, his comrade would suffer too, and that together they had some minimal chance to endure. This brotherhood was not an abstract concept, but a daily phenomenon made of concrete gestures, of details burned into the most miserable routines. Daily life in the trenches and advanced positions was shaped by that forced coexistence. The men shared the same cot or slept in the same hole in the ground, back to back, to keep from freezing. They passed along their threadbare blankets, exchanged still damp socks just to ease the companion who no longer felt his feet. In the endless marches, an exhausted soldier clung to the backpack of the one ahead to keep from collapsing, and that man dragged him without looking back. Brotherhood was expressed in those small acts of solidarity, invisible in official reports but essential for survival. Sharing food was a ritual charged with meaning. When a ration arrived, no matter how scarce, it was instinctively divided. A piece of hard bread, a can of meat, a cigarette was split in 2 or 3, even when no one knew if there would be more the next day. The lit cigarette passed from hand to hand, each one inhaling deeply, closing his eyes as if that smoke were a momentary pause from hell. The watery soup was shared from the same tin, sip by sip, with spoons that went from mouth to mouth. It was not only about feeding themselves, it was a tacit pact of collective survival. Black humor was another cement of brotherhood. Amid bombardments and corpses, the soldiers told macabre jokes about their own fate, laughed at the clumsiness of their officers, or invented grotesque songs about death that hovered over them each day. Laughing at misfortune was not frivolity, but a way of defying it. The shared laughter amid a bombardment was stronger than the shells. It made fear bearable. Mutual care was also shown in the most intimate moments. When a man fell ill, his comrades covered him with extra blankets, gave him part of their rations, helped him rise for guard duty even when it was their turn to rest. If someone was wounded, it was his comrade who dragged him through the mud, even under enemy fire, because the idea of leaving him behind was unbearable. Brotherhood was strengthened in those acts of personal sacrifice that appeared neither in medals nor reports, but were the true backbone of the troop. During long night watches, when silence became unbearable and the cold pierced to the bone, comrades told each other stories of their homes. There were tales of sweethearts waiting, of fathers working the land, of distant cities full of lights that seemed unreal in the dark steppe. Those stories were shared as treasures. Every word was a reminder that beyond the misery of the front, there was a civilian life that might one day be recovered. Brotherhood was not only physical but emotional. The men carried the memories and hopes of their comrades as much as their own backpacks. Death reinforced that bond. When a comrade fell, the others improvised a burial, even if it was only a hole in the mud or some branches placed over the body. They sang a low song, recited a prayer, or simply remained silent for a few minutes, knowing that the next day it could be any of them. Marking the grave with a helmet or an improvised cross was an act of collective respect. It meant that even amid annihilation, the comrade was not forgotten. Each burial left a wound, but also reaffirmed the commitment to carry on for those who were no longer there. In the fiercest battles, brotherhood took the form of instinctive coordination. Soldiers knew how the man beside them moved, how he raised his rifle when he ran, and when he dropped to the ground. That trust was vital. Amid a rain of bullets, seeing the comrade still alive was enough to take another step. In many cases, that coordination saved lives. One comrade threw a grenade, while another covered his advance. One fired, while the other dragged a wounded man. Without that synchrony born of daily coexistence, the unit would have collapsed. Alcohol, when it appeared, was a catalyst of brotherhood. A flask of brandy, stolen or delivered on rare moments of rest, was shared by all, regardless of rank. They drank from the same bottle, one after another, while laughter mixed with hidden tears. Those moments were fleeting but served to release accumulated tension. To say what could not be said amid military rigidity, alcohol became a symbol, a moment of humanity among men reduced to war machines. Letters from home reinforced those bonds. Whoever received correspondence usually read fragments aloud to his comrades, sharing news of civilian life that everyone longed for. A letter was not just for one. It became collective nourishment, a reminder that there was still a world beyond the front. In contrast, when someone went months without receiving news, the comrades comforted him, invented stories about how the mail was delayed, or shared memories of their own families to fill that emptiness. Brotherhood also showed itself in resisting the abuses of superiors. Although discipline was rigid, many times the rank-and-file soldiers protected one another against the absurd demands of an officer. If someone failed an inspection, the whole group took the blame, fixing the mistake together to avoid harsher punishment. That complicity created a sense of silent resistance against an authority that often seemed detached from the reality of the front. In field hospitals, comrades visited the wounded whenever they could. They brought tobacco, shared news, promised to guard their belongings until they returned. They knew many would never come back, but that gesture was vital. It meant that even in a hospital bed, a soldier was not alone. The gravely wounded asked their comrades to send letters to their families if they did not survive. Fulfilling those promises became a sacred duty, a pact that transcended the war itself. Brotherhood also had a dark side. The pressure not to fail the group could be unbearable. A soldier who showed fear was isolated, labeled a burden. The group could protect, but it could also destroy the one who did not measure up. That duality made many men push beyond their limits, enduring wounds, hunger, and cold to avoid being abandoned. Brotherhood was both refuge and chain. It forced them to resist even when body and mind begged to surrender. In the end, comradeship was not a luxury, but the only possible response to a war that devoured everything. Every piece of bread shared, every cigarette passed from hand to hand, every story told in a frozen trench was an act of human resistance against a system that had reduced soldiers to numbers. The real life of the Lanzer was marked by that brutal brotherhood, born of necessity and shared suffering. Without it, the Eastern Front would have been an unbearable void. With it, it became a shared hell where at least no one was alone. Prisoners and civilians, the brutality of contact. On the Eastern Front, the boundary between combat and occupation blurred until it disappeared. It was not only about facing armies on the battlefield. Each day, German soldiers lived alongside captured prisoners and a civilian population that became a direct target of the war. The real life of the Lanzer was crossed by that daily relationship with the defeated, a relationship marked by hunger, distrust, violence, and contempt. It was a brutal contact where the smallest details, a piece of bread, a glance, an order, could decide life or death. The captured Soviets were driven in endless columns, guarded by German soldiers who could barely contain their shock at what they saw. Tens of thousands of men without coats, with destroyed boots or simply rags on their feet, staggered along frozen roads. The stench was unbearable: unwashed bodies, infected wounds, diarrhea running down their legs. The guards had hardly any instructions beyond keeping them moving. Hunger made the prisoners pick grains from the ground or eat dry grass, and those who collapsed from exhaustion were pushed aside with rifle butts or simply shot by the roadside. The improvised camps were scenes of death in slow motion. Poorly strung barbed wire enclosed empty lots where prisoners were crowded together without shelter, exposed to the elements. In winter, temperatures dropped to tens of degrees below zero, and masses of men huddled together to avoid freezing. Without enough food, they devoured whatever they could, first dead horses, then grass, later rats, and even corpses. The Lanzer who guarded those scenes were marked for life. Some grew hardened to the point of indifference. Others were silently horrified but still obeyed orders. Giving water or a piece of bread to a prisoner could be punished as treason. The treatment was brutal because policy demanded it. The enemy was considered subhuman, and the prisoners were seen as a logistical problem rather than as human beings. Many German soldiers later admitted that it was easier to get used to combat than to guarding thousands of starving men dying slowly before their eyes. The guards counted corpses each morning and dragged them out of the camp, piling them into heaps that grew like macabre mountains. The transport of prisoners offered no relief either. Freight cars, closed with barely any ventilation, carried hundreds of men for days without water or food. When the doors were opened, what emerged was an unbearable stench and piles of bodies, some still breathing, others dead from suffocation or being crushed. For the soldiers guarding those trains, the spectacle was routine, as ordinary as loading ammunition or fuel. Dehumanization permeated every act. Contact with civilians was no less brutal. Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian villages became scenes of systematic looting. Soldiers seized bread, milk, eggs, meat, whatever they could find. For the Lanzer, famished and exhausted, those raids were a matter of survival. They entered ramshackle houses, found women and children trembling by the fire, and took the little they had. The order was clear. Everything had to serve the war effort. For the civilians, that meant immediate hunger. Reprisals were frequent. If a train was sabotaged or a patrol attacked by partisans, nearby villages paid the price. Houses were burned, public executions carried out, deportations ordered. The ordinary soldier participated because there was no choice. Orders were received to burn, shoot, or evacuate, and obedience was absolute. Many Lanzer described the feeling of horror at having to set fire to a hut while peasants wept on their knees, but few refused. Discipline and fear of being accused of cowardice or treason outweighed any scruples. Winter made everything more cruel. Soldiers without adequate shelter occupied peasant homes, driving families out into the snow. One hut could house 10 or 15 Lanzer while the civilians wandered homeless. Daily contact became an unequal exchange, armed soldiers with absolute power facing peasants reduced to misery. That relationship was one of constant domination, where even the smallest gestures, a pleading motion, a hateful look, could unleash violence. Hunger bound both sides in a spiral of desperation. The soldiers searched for food in the villages. The civilians struggled to survive the raids. In some cases, barter relationships were established. Bread for cigarettes, milk for a blanket, eggs for a piece of soap. But the balance was always fragile. A mere rumor of partisan activity was enough to end everything in blood. Contact with the partisans made civilian life even more trapped in brutality. The guerrillas attacked trains, convoys, patrols, and the Germans responded with massive violence. Soldiers suddenly found themselves participating in cleansing operations, surrounding a forest, shooting any suspect, destroying entire villages. The fear of ambushes kept the troops in constant tension. Sleeping in an occupied town meant doing so with the rifle loaded beside the bed, knowing that at any moment the house could be set on fire or a grenade thrown through the window. The peasants caught between both sides were permanent victims. If they collaborated with the Germans, they were killed by the partisans. If they helped the partisans, they were shot by the Germans. For the common soldier, that ambiguity translated into absolute distrust toward any civilian. An old woman begging for bread could be a spy, a child waving could be marking positions. That daily paranoia corroded morale and hardened gestures. Many preferred to shoot first rather than risk an ambush. The brutality of contact with prisoners and civilians left deep scars on the soldiers. Many became desensitized. They learned to look without seeing, to obey without thinking, to turn others' misery into part of the landscape. Others, on the contrary, carried silent guilt. The images of starving prisoners, burning villages, women weeping as they were evicted from their homes engraved themselves in their memory more deeply than battles. The Lanzer knew he was fighting not only against soldiers but against an entire world of defenseless people, and that certainty slowly tore apart his humanity. The everyday detail was always the same: a piece of bread snatched away, a prisoner falling into the snow, a child crying before a burning hut. That was the real life of the German soldier in the East, a routine of violence not only against the armed enemy but against the hungry and the weak. In that constant contact with misery and civilian death, the war showed its most brutal face, one that needed no great battles to destroy the very essence of those who lived it. Propaganda as an invisible weapon. Propaganda was the invisible chain that kept the German soldier standing at the front, even when his body was collapsing from hunger, cold, and exhaustion. It did not come in the form of grenades or gunfire, but of printed words, voices on the radio, images projected on improvised screens in a ruined village. Every message was designed to penetrate the mind of the Lanzer, to tear away doubt, to anesthetize compassion, and to remind him that he was not a man, but a cog in the Reich's machinery. Campaign newspapers circulated from hand to hand in the muddy trenches. The cheap paper became soaked with snow and mud, but the headlines were clear: colossal victories, enemies in flight, the Reich advancing toward an inevitable destiny. The soldiers read those pages while around them lay the corpses of their frozen comrades, and even so some closed their eyes and pretended to believe. It was easier to cling to the lie than to face the naked truth that their divisions were being pulverized. that the strategic withdrawal was in truth a desperate escape. During moments of rest in the rear, UFA newsreels were projected. The men sat on improvised benches surrounded by tobacco smoke and the stench of damp uniforms, and watched images of tanks advancing triumphantly, airplanes crossing the sky as if invincible, immaculate soldiers smiling at the camera. The room burst into applause, but behind those claps there was a deep emptiness. Those who sat there knew the film was a farce. The front, they knew, had nothing of smiles or shining uniforms, only mud, hunger, and fear. Yet they wept silently at the sight of a German landscape on the screen, a reminder of a lost world that no longer belonged to them. The speeches of the officers were knives in the icy air. The soldiers, aligned with cracked lips and bloodied feet, listened to phrases about the historical mission of destroying Bolshevism, about the eternal glory of sacrifice. The wind carried the words away, yet they pierced all the same. A Lanza shivering with fever could endure one more day if he believed he was protecting his mother from the Soviets, his sister from the subhuman Asiatics. Ideology was as lethal as bullets. It justified every atrocity, every civilian corpse, every prisoner abandoned in the snow. The radio repeated night and day the firm voice from Berlin. In shattered huts, the soldiers huddled around crackling devices, listening to reports of victories they had never seen. The announcer spoke of relentless advances, of conquered cities, while they themselves gathered their dead in wheelbarrows. The contradiction was obscene, but it did not matter. The radio did not need to convince, only to sustain the spark of hope, the minimal illusion that kept a soldier from putting a bullet in his mouth in the trench. Propaganda also poisoned with hatred. Leaflets and posters depicted the Soviets as rats, as soulless beasts, as hordes that had to be exterminated. When the Lanza saw starving prisoners covered in sores, he no longer recognized them as men but as caricatures of what propaganda had promised. Letting a prisoner starve, shooting a suspicious peasant, burning an entire village, everything seemed justified because the repeated words and images had erased all compassion. The enemy was not human and therefore did not deserve mercy. With time, the gap between illusion and reality became unbearable. Newspapers kept speaking of victories while the soldiers buried dozens of comrades each day. The newsreels showed panzer divisions advancing across sunny fields, while on the real front the tanks were frozen, stuck in the snow, abandoned for lack of fuel. The Lanza knew he was being deceived, but he needed to believe the lie because the truth was unbearable, that they were alone, defeated, and that the Reich promised to be eternal was collapsing on their shoulders. Even the letters they wrote were intimate propaganda. They did not speak of hunger or cold or bodies swollen by typhus. Instead, they described small victories, exaggerated any positive detail, invented a less cruel front for their mothers and wives. They lied not only to spare them worry, but because they needed to convince themselves. That was the last trench of propaganda, the lie written by one's own hand as a spell against horror. Propaganda was an invisible weapon, but no less brutal than a cannon. It did not kill with explosions, but with resignation. It kept the soldiers standing when their bodies could no longer endure, tore away their compassion, convinced them to keep firing, to keep advancing over a sea of corpses. It was the voice whispering in the ear of the frozen, starving Lanza that his suffering had meaning, even when in truth it did not. It was the last iron shackle that kept them chained to a regime that used them as cannon fodder, and the cruelest of all, because it pierced not the skin, but the mind. Foreigners in the SS, between illusion and the abyss. The life of the foreigners who enlisted in the Waffen-SS was a mixture of fanaticism, deceit, brutality, and uprooting. They were French, Flemish, Walloon, Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Croatian, Hungarian, even Spanish and Russian men who, in the name of the anti-Bolshevik crusade or for promises of privilege, ended up wearing the black or camouflaged uniform of the Waffen-SS. In propaganda, they were presented as warriors of a Europe united under the Reich. In reality, they experienced a harsh process of integration, full of humiliation, inhuman conditions, and an almost always bloody fate in the steppes and forests of the East. The first shock began in training. The foreign volunteers arrived at the barracks of Senheim in Alsace, Debica in Poland, or Klagenfurt in Austria. There they discovered that they were not treated as equals. German officers looked at them with distrust, called them mercenaries or southern animals, and punished them more harshly than their German counterparts. Language was a constant barrier. The Flemish or French received orders in German they barely understood. Anyone who made a mistake during formation was beaten or humiliated before everyone. The result was a daily life made of insults, shouted corrections, and a constant sense of inferiority. Discipline was identical to that of the Germans, but with an added burden. They had to prove themselves worthy of wearing the SS uniform. That meant longer marches, harsher punishments, and the obligation to maintain exaggerated zeal in cleaning the uniform and equipment. Instructors constantly reminded them that they were not pure Germanic blood, that they had to earn the right to fight alongside Aryan comrades. The Flemish were mocked for their laziness, the French for their decadent spirit, the Spanish for their Mediterranean indiscipline. Daily life was a parade of tests and humiliations. Cultural clashes appeared in the smallest details. The French tried to maintain table customs, such as drinking wine or talking during meals, and were reprimanded for not eating in silence like the Germans. The Spanish improvised songs or jokes in the barracks and were punished for disturbing the rigid nighttime calm. The Nordics, who expected to be treated as racial brothers, discovered that they too were viewed with a certain disdain for their lack of discipline. Letters home were filled with complaints about the harshness of training, the contempt of officers, and homesickness. At the front, however, brotherhood overcame ideology. Hunger and cold erased national differences. Frenchmen of the Charlemagne division, Flemings of the Langemarck, Walloons of the Wallonian, Scandinavians of the Viking shared trenches, cigarettes, and blankets. In the snow of Ukraine or the forests of Belarus, language no longer mattered. What mattered was that the man beside you fired when the T-34 approached, that he covered you while you dragged a wounded comrade, that he shared with you the last tin of canned meat. There, the foreigner found a brotherhood that had been denied him in the barracks. Treatment, however, remained unequal. Casualties among foreigners were far higher. They were sent to the most exposed sectors, used as cannon fodder in impossible counterattacks, or as rearguard in desperate retreats. Many German officers did not hesitate to sacrifice entire battalions of foreign volunteers to save German units. The foreigner quickly learned that the rhetoric of United Europe remained propaganda. In practice, they were second-class soldiers. Material conditions were brutal. On the Eastern Front, foreigners suffered the same hunger and cold as the Germans, but with less logistical support. The battalions of the Charlemagne, for example, received mismatched uniforms, worn boots, and outdated weapons. Many marched with captured Czech or French rifles, while the Germans kept the best Mausers and MP-40 submachine guns. The contrast was humiliating. They were supposed to fight for the same cause, but the distribution of resources revealed the Reich's real priorities. The most brutal experiences came in combat. At Narva, the Scandinavians of the Viking and Nordland fought in a hell of mud and fire, losing entire companies in a matter of days. In the Caucasus, the Flemings were thrown against heavily defended Soviet positions, suffering massive losses. At Stettin, the French of the Charlemagne were forced to stop Soviet tanks with only panzerfausts, watching their comrades turn into twisted flesh and metal beneath the treads. The accounts of survivors are a catalogue of atrocious scenes: men burning alive inside flaming houses, bodies frozen in trenches, comrades devoured by wild dogs as they lay in the snow. Despite everything, many foreigners remained convinced they were fighting for a cause. Propaganda was even more intense with them than with the Germans. They were told repeatedly that they were defending Europe from Bolshevik barbarism, that their sacrifices would be remembered like those of Crusader heroes. That illusion sustained them, even though the reality was that the Reich used them as disposable flesh. The contradiction was evident. They were promised glory, but what they received was contempt and death. Relations with the occupied civilian population were ambiguous. Some foreigners, especially the French and Flemish, sought sympathy among the peasants, shared wine, or tried to learn the local language. But anti-partisan operations forced them to take part in reprisals, burning villages and shooting innocents. Many found themselves trapped in a spiral of guilt and fanaticism. They knew they were participating in crimes, but they also knew that the only way out was to keep shooting, because surrender meant being hanged by the Soviets as traitors. Daily life in the foreign Waffen-SS was made up of brutal details: sleeping in wooden barracks infested with lice, with damp blankets and mud-covered floors, marching 40 kilometers with torn boots. waking in the early morning with frozen feet and a German officer shouting "mercenaries" at them, eating hard bread with watery soup while German officers received better rations, watching comrades die from lack of boots, from frostbite, from typhus, more often than from enemy bullets. When the war neared its end, the foreigners in the SS lived through the most desperate experiences. In Berlin, in April of 1945, the French of the Charlemagne defended the ruins of the capital to the last man. The Soviets hunted them like animals. Many died in combat, others were executed on the spot when captured. For the survivors, the end was as cruel as the war itself. Prison camps, summary executions, long sentences, absolute contempt in their home countries. No one wanted to remember those men. They were traitors at home and defeated in Germany. Such was the real life of the foreigners in the Waffen-SS. An existence marked by hunger, humiliation, the distrust of their own comrades, and the brutality of a front that crushed them without mercy. They sought glory and belonging, but what they found was contempt and death. In their diaries and testimonies remain the most brutal details: the ill-fitting uniform, the defective rifle, the piece of bread shared in a frozen trench, the bitter laughter of a comrade who knew they would not survive the winter. The illusion of a Europe united under the swastika ended up being, for them, a direct journey into hell.